Before we get to the story, I'd like to say thanks so much for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading cosmic horror related stories every single day. So if that sounds good, please drop a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a lot, especially when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. Saturation diving is one of those occupations that sounds extreme until you've been doing it long enough that it becomes simply the texture of your working life, and then it sounds extreme again when you try to explain it to someone who hasn't done it. The basic premise is that the human body, subjected to the pressure changes of repeated deep dives, accumulates dissolved gas in the tissues that has to be released slowly to avoid the kind of damage that ends careers and sometimes lives. Saturation diving sidesteps the problem by keeping the diver at pressure continuously, living in a pressurized habitat chamber on the support vessel for the duration of a job, working at depth through a pressurized transfer bell, and only returning to surface pressure once at the end of the deployment through a decompression schedule that takes days. You go down once. You stay down for weeks. You come back up once. In between, the ocean floor is where you work, and the habitat chamber is where you sleep and eat and spend every hour you're not in the water. And the world at surface pressure is something you remember rather than experience. I had been doing it for 12 years by the time the Gulf job came through, which put me in the category of experienced enough to be trusted with jobs that required judgment in addition to technical skill. The company I worked for held contracts with several offshore energy firms, and the Gulf of Mexico was a regular operating area, pipeline inspection and maintenance work at depths between 500 and 1,000 feet that the platform-based crews couldn't reach with conventional diving. The inspection job that autumn was a pipeline route check, a standard integrity assessment of a line that ran across a section of the Gulf floor in a part of the field that hadn't been physically inspected in several years. My dive partner on the job was a man named Casso, 11 years in the trade, the kind of diver who treated extreme conditions with a matter-of-factness that I'd always found professionally reassuring. We'd worked together on 4 previous jobs and had developed the wordless efficiency that long-term dive partnerships produce. In saturation diving, the person you're tethered to is the person your life depends on, and trust at that level either develops quickly or it doesn't develop at all. We went into saturation on a Monday, the pressurization process taking the better part of a day to bring us to working depth equivalent. The habitat chamber, our entire world, as the pressure climbed and the sounds of the vessel around us changed character in the way that pressurized environments change the character of sound. It's a process I'd been through enough times that it had become routine in the way that boarding a plane becomes routine, the individual steps familiar, even when the destination is somewhere you've never been. The first 2 days of the inspection were standard work. Casso and I transferred to the bell, dropped to the pipeline route, and worked our way along it in the methodical way that inspection work proceeds, checking the pipeline's condition and logging anything that needed attention. The Gulf floor in that section was what the survey charts described: soft sediment with occasional hard substrate outcroppings, visibility that varied with the current, and the sediment disturbance our movement produced. The particular quality of darkness at that depth that I had been working in long enough to find comfortable rather than oppressive. The third day was different from the moment we reached the floor. The sediment changed character about 100 meters along the route from our drop point, the soft bottom giving way to harder substrate in a transition that the survey charts hadn't noted. I logged it and kept moving, because substrate transitions happened and survey charts had gaps, and the pipeline's condition was the job rather than the geology it sat on. But the hard substrate continued, and as I moved along the route, the surface beneath the pipeline resolved, in the sweep of my helmet light, into something that the geological vocabulary I carried didn't accommodate. Cut stone. The same identification process I described for the Turkish mountain. The same recognition sequence of feature after feature that geological process doesn't produce. Right angles and flat surfaces, and the fitted relationship between adjacent pieces that only intentional work creates. The pipeline ran across it, had been laid across it years ago by a crew that either hadn't seen it or hadn't reported it, and it sat on the Gulf floor at depth, as if it had always been there, which I was beginning to understand. It had. I told the surface what I was seeing. The response from the dive supervisor was to continue the inspection and document what I observed, which was the correct procedural response, and which I noted at the time was delivered with a flatness that didn't include any of the surprise I'd expected. When you tell a dive supervisor you're looking at what appears to be worked stone on the Gulf floor, the normal response involves some version of "what do you mean? Can you describe it? Are you sure?" The response I got was continue the inspection and document what you observe, clean and immediate and ready, like a line that had been prepared. I continued. The city came into view the way it was always going to come into view, at that depth, incrementally. The limits of underwater visibility at that depth, meaning that each new structure appeared at the edge of my lights as I moved toward it, the city building itself in my perception piece by piece, rather than revealing itself all at once. Structures of significant scale built from the same cut stone as the substrate the pipeline ran across, rising from the Gulf floor in configurations that were unambiguously architectural. Walls and spaces and the openings between them that created the internal geography of a built environment. The preservation was wrong for the depth and the age that the depth implied. The Gulf of Mexico in its current form is a geologically recent feature, the sea level changes of the glacial cycles having repeatedly altered the coastlines and the depths of the region, and the depth at which these structures sat corresponded to a period when this section of the Gulf floor had been dry land. A city built here would have been built before the water came, which placed its construction at a point in time that the state of the structures was inconsistent with. Structures of that age, submerged for that long, should have shown the deterioration that thousands of years of submersion produces. These showed none of it. Casso was 20 meters to my left on his own survey line, and I could see his helmet lamp moving through the outer structures. We communicated through the hardwire comm system, short exchanges in the clipped language of divers who have learned to say what matters and nothing else. And what we exchanged in those first minutes was the shared confirmation of what we were each seeing, the wordless, professional acknowledgement that we were both looking at the same thing and that the thing was real. I was documenting the facade of a structure that stood roughly 4 meters above the surrounding floor, when my light caught movement inside it. I want to be careful about how I describe this because the temptation in retrospect is to make it more dramatic than the moment itself was, and the moment itself was dramatic enough without embellishment. The movement was in the structure's interior, visible through an opening in the facade that the structure's design had placed at a height appropriate for entry. Organized movement, directional, the movement of something crossing the interior space with a purpose rather than drifting with the current. The current at that depth was minimal. What I was watching wasn't being moved by water. It was moving. I reported it to the surface. The dive supervisor told me to continue toward the pipeline's route through the city's interior section and to maintain my documentation. Again, the flatness, the absence of surprise in a response that should have contained it. I moved along the route. The city's outer districts gave way to denser structure as I moved inward. The buildings larger and more closely spaced, the spaces between them narrower, the characteristic densification of a city's center that I had seen in every built environment I'd encountered above water, and that the Gulf floor city reproduced exactly. Casso paralleled me on the offset line, and we kept our comm exchanges to position confirmations and documentation notes. Both of us focused on the work and on the movement we were each intermittently catching in the structures around us. The movement was consistent, not the same individual, or not necessarily, but the same quality of movement appearing repeatedly in the structures on both sides of our route, organized and interior, the movement of something that lived in these spaces and was moving through them the way things move through spaces they know well, not reacting to us, not orienting toward us, just present and active in the city around us while we moved through it. That changed when we reached the central structure. The pipeline road passed within 30 meters of the largest building at the city's geographic center, a structure that my lights could only partially illuminate given its scale, rising higher than the surrounding buildings and extending laterally further than any other single structure in the city. I was documenting its facade, running my lights along its lower section and logging what the camera was capturing, when the opening in the structure's base, directly ahead of me on the route, produced something. It came out slowly. I've tried many times to describe what I saw with enough precision to be useful, and I've never fully succeeded. And I think the failure is genuine rather than evasive. At that depth, in that visibility, with my helmet light as the only illumination and the darkness complete beyond his range, what I saw was partial, and the partial nature of what I saw is part of what I saw. Something came out of the structure's entrance with the deliberateness of something that had made a decision, moving toward me at a pace that covered the distance between us without urgency. And what my light showed me of it as it came was enough to understand its scale, which was larger than the entrance it had come through in a way that I still don't have a good explanation for, and its movement, which was the movement of something completely at home in that environment in a way that I was not. It stopped at about 15 meters. I had backed up along the pipeline to what felt like a defensible position, which in retrospect was a meaningless concept at that depth in that situation. And I was holding position, and it was holding position, and we were 15 meters apart in the darkness of the Gulf floor with my helmet lamp between us and nothing else. It didn't approach further. It didn't retreat. It held its position with the quality of something that had decided to stop and was comfortable with the decision. And I held mine because moving toward it was not something I was going to do, and moving away from it along the pipeline was something I was doing very slowly and carefully, and hoping it wasn't going to change its decision about stopping. The surface recalled us to the bell after what the dive log records as 11 minutes of stationary position, though my internal sense of that time was considerably longer. The bell came down, Casso and I transferred, and we went back up to the habitat without discussion and sat in the habitat chamber not talking for a while, which was its own form of communication. The job ended the following day. No explanation, no incident report that we were asked to file, just the notification that the inspection was complete and we were beginning the decompression schedule, which took the standard days and gave us a lot of time in the habitat chamber to talk about what we'd seen and what we'd decided about it. What we'd decided was that the surface had known. The debrief happened in a company office at the port facility. 2 representatives from the offshore client rather than from our diving company, which was the first structural irregularity. They asked detailed questions about the city's layout, the structural condition, the visibility, and the current conditions, all of which were reasonable questions for an offshore company to ask about a section of Gulf floor their pipeline crossed. They asked one question about the thing I'd encountered at the central structure, a single question phrased with a specificity that indicated they already knew something had been there, that the question was about what I had seen rather than whether I had seen anything. They asked how close it had come. Not did you see anything, not can you describe what you observed. How close did it come, the question of someone who knew something was there and wanted to know whether it had approached. I told them 15 meters, and they wrote it down and moved on, and that was the only question about it in the entire debrief. And the decision to ask exactly one question about it told me more than the question itself did. They knew about the city. The pipeline had been routed through that section deliberately. The inspection job had been designed to put eyes on it, and whatever they were trying to learn about the city and its contents, the debriefing questions were not about the ruins. They were specifically, precisely about the living thing inside them, which meant the city was already documented, which meant something else had been down there before us and had come back with enough information to plan a follow-up, and the follow-up was us, and whatever they'd learned from our visit, they used to answer a question they'd had since whoever went before us came back. I don't know what's in the city. I know what I saw of it at 15 meters in the darkness, which is partial knowledge of something I don't have a category for. I know the city has been on the Gulf floor since before the Gulf was the Gulf, and I know something has been living in it for some portion of that time, and I know that a company with offshore operations in that section of the Gulf has been managing that knowledge carefully enough to use a pipeline inspection job as cover for a reconnaissance visit. The pipeline still runs through that section of the Gulf floor. Inspection jobs still happen. I'm not in the trade anymore, left it the year after the Gulf job, and I have no way of knowing whether subsequent inspection crews have been told what the pipeline crosses or whether they find it the way Casso and I found it. I think about that 15 meters sometimes. It stopped at 15 meters and held. I don't know if that was a decision about me specifically or a general rule about distance. I don't know if it had seen divers before and had calibrated its response based on that experience, or if I was the first and it was making the decision in real time. I don't know which of those options I find less comfortable. I just know it stopped, and I know I was grateful that it did.